market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, it's a little over 15 months since Donald Trump won a second term as U.S. president with a promise not to start any more wars. But at the weekend, the U.S. and Israel launched a bombing campaign in Iran with the stated aim of regime change. Well, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei was killed in a strike on his compound on Saturday. The Iranian Foreign Ministry says a successor will be elected within days. In the meantime, it's launched a campaign of retaliatory strikes against U.S. targets across the Middle East, hitting the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. President Trump has warned the conflict could go on for several weeks.
Combat operations continue at this time in full force, and they will continue until all of our objectives are achieved.
Well, let's get more from Bloomberg's Jumana Barsechi in Dubai. Jumana, so first of all, good morning. I know it's a very difficult situation just living in the Middle East right now. What's the situation like at present?
Thank you, Francine. Well, yes, it's been an extremely fraught couple of days. And I will tell you that it's very clear from everything that has gone down over the course of the weekend that this has become a regional conflict. There are 11 countries in the Middle East now involved in the Iran crisis and the various retaliatory responses. I think what's also clear is that there doesn't appear to be any imminent off-ramp or chance for de-escalation. President Trump there, you played a little bit of what he was saying from his comments yesterday, and he said that they're not going to let up until their objectives have been achieved. A similar language coming through from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday, saying that if anything, they plan on intensifying their attacks in the coming days. And really what started out as an operation on Saturday morning targeting specific personnel, of course, the Supreme Leader himself, and he was assassinated, his key advisors, along with the Commander-in-Chief of the IRGC. That is spread to include more infrastructure, military infrastructure, rocket launchers, their defense system, and then also President Trump confirming yesterday that 9 Iranian warships had also been destroyed and that they're in the process of destroying the Iranian Navy. Now, in response to that, Iran isn't going down quietly, and what they're doing is they're sending out missiles and drones across various U.S. assets dotted around the Gulf countries and in the Levant as well. However, the sheer extent and the volume of these rockets have been difficult for these air defense systems to fully intercept. So there has been some damage leveled by the debris on buildings. The airports, key airports around the GCC have also been targeted as well, which means flights have been suspended. Over 300,000 people are in a state of disarray and currently stranded across the Gulf region. And then this morning, they took it one step further on reports that this refinery in Saudi Arabia, in Aramco, Ras Al Tanura, has also been targeted as well, and this has just been confirmed a short while ago by the Saudi Ministry of Energy. It is another escalation because it shows that they're also beginning to target energy infrastructure. Similarly, Iran also claimed that they had shot down an F-35 jet flying over Kuwait. So a lot of escalation. And one other front also opened up this morning in Lebanon too, with Hezbollah firing rockets into northern Israel. Israel subsequently responding with heavy bombardment of southern Beirut.
Jumana, Iran's national security chief also says there will be no negotiating with the U.S. How key is that?
This was a big moment. So Ali Larijani is who you're referring to. He's very influential within the regime. He's been helping shape policy for decades and is the key man when it comes to determining military strategy and nuclear strategy for the Iranians. And over the course of the weekend and yesterday, there were some reports emerging that perhaps the Iranians coming under this type of pressure would be open to having conversations once again with the U.S. And the fact that Mr. Larijani or Ali Larijani this morning said that negotiations are not on the table, that was a signal that their resolve is ever hardened and that they will try as much as possible to continue retaliating against these various targets around the Gulf, around the Levant, and of course, Israel as well. I will say that President Trump has made it very clear that the objective is a change of regime. He's quite explicitly said yesterday, or he called on the Iranian military and the Revolutionary Guard to lay down their weapons and get immunity, otherwise face, quote unquote, a certain death. So the objective here is either a capitulation of the Iranian regime or a collapse, and a full collapse obviously would mean that you'd have to get support as well from the Iranian population, which so far there are no signs of that really happening on the streets of Iran and of Tehran, which is what we're watching out for very closely to see if whether the people are going to join in as well in this uprising.
Joanna, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Joanna Barsachi there in Dubai. Now, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are stepping up criticism of Iran's regional attacks. An emergency meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council concluded with a statement in which members criticized what they called treacherous and heinous actions by Tehran. Let's bring in Tina Fordham, founder and geopolitical strategist at Fordham Global Foresight, and Hasan, Alhasan, senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and a former foreign policy analyst for the Crown Prince of Bahrain. So thank you both for joining us. Tina, how do you see this? I mean, again, actually, the possible outcomes for Iran, for oil price and the global economy seem to be very wide at the moment. What do you look to for signs that actually this either escalates or de-escalates?
Well, I think right now everything is on the table, and the signs are that we are heading toward a full-blown regional conflagration with great uncertainty being triggered, of course, for markets and for energy supplies. After all, it was Iran that triggered the world's biggest oil price shock, but also the retaliation response from Tehran expanding to so many Gulf countries, neighboring states, the activation of Hezbollah and Hamas, the red line there having been the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei. Really, it's difficult to see this de-escalating anytime soon, especially given that for Iran it is an existential battle. For Israel, this is the opportunity that Netanyahu has been waiting for more than a decade, and neither the United States nor the European countries that have now been drawn in have prepared their populations for what's happening.
So, Hasan, how do you see this developing? Again, the GCC countries, I don't know whether they are still very surprised by the force at which Iran counterattacked and what happens in the next couple of days.
Yeah, I think we look for multiple signs of escalation and de-escalation. I mean, militarily, we're tracking closely the number of UAVs and missiles that Iran has been firing. Now, the first day was particularly intense. The second day was fairly calmer, and we're seeing numbers beginning to drop down, at least in the Gulf context. So there is that military sort of quantitative layer of the number of projectiles that Iran is able to fire at its neighbors and beyond at Israel. And that is obviously going to be a function as well of how effectively the US and Israel are able to preempt these strikes by targeting Iranian missile launchers before they're able to launch. There is another dimension to the military campaign as well, which is the qualitative one. And we're seeing now Iran begin to target high-value economic assets. They've managed to temporarily disable the Ras Al Noura refinery in Saudi Arabia. They've targeted multiple oil tankers close to the Strait of Hormuz, and have managed to depress maritime activity going through the strait. Politically, it will depend on how President Trump defines the end goal of this campaign. He's kept it very broad. He's kept it about regime change, and I think by all estimates, that's going to be difficult to do through air power alone. So I think President Trump will keep waging the campaign and shuffling through Iranian leadership by constantly targeting them until a leader emerges either from within the present configuration of Iran or beyond it if the regime is further destabilized. That is more pragmatic and willing to de-escalate. But we haven't seen that yet.
And Tina, how do you see, Iran doesn't have many allies. Russia is still an ally. We're unclear about what China's thinking right now. Again, is there a danger that these two countries get involved?
I wouldn't say so. Neither Russia nor China have indicated any willingness to support Iran. Iran is really isolated. In a way, I think that makes the dynamics that much more dangerous. I mean, Russia has not been a useful ally for any of its so-called security partners, most recently Venezuela, nor Syria, and others. China, of course, gets a lot of oil from Iran. But at the moment, this is an opportunity for China to watch the United States become embroiled in yet another conflict and leave it alone. And so the risk isn't that China or Russia get involved to help Iran, it seems to me, but that Iran feels so isolated that it expands its willingness to activate targets and cause collateral damage, partly because Iran, like market participants, is hoping to make Trump taco, right, by inflicting such sufficient damage on oil prices and on financial markets that Trump climbs down. And actually, it's not necessarily a wrong strategy.
Yeah, and I guess, Hasan, to Tina's point, I mean, there are three things that I would be watching. It's Iran's ability to sustain the attacks, the GCC countries, the Gulf states, to repel a lot of these attacks, and then, of course, what happens to energy infrastructure. How worried should we be about Iran actually closing the Strait of Hormuz, or just going after, very aggressively some of these energy infrastructures?
Iran is probably incapable of fully closing the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. Has extensive intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities that are dedicated to monitoring any Iranian attempts at, for example, laying sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Those would be very high risk and would pose a long-term challenge. So the U.S., I take it, is actively monitoring and preempting such attempts. But if we look at the way the Houthis have been able to disrupt maritime navigation through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and through the Red Sea, it doesn't take much to do that. An occasional threat, an occasional drone or missile launched at a tanker here and there is probably sufficient to dissuade many shipping companies and operators from navigating through these waters. It's likely to cause insurance companies to cancel policies and to raise insurance prices and to keep oil prices elevated. So Iran doesn't need much, really, doesn't need to do much to continue disrupting the flow of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz. And it doesn't need to do much to keep disrupting energy infrastructure as well. An occasional drone here or there against a refinery would be sufficient to put it out of business for some time. Now, the question of what impact that is going to have on global oil prices. We've seen the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other OPEC plus countries ramp up production in recent weeks in anticipation of such instability. And it will also depend on how prolonged this conflict ends up being.
Hasan, is there anything actually that the Gulf states can now do to try and protect their energy infrastructure, their oil infrastructure, to make sure that there's not too much instability that could, as Tina said, then make President Trump actually scale back?
So militarily speaking, Gulf air and missile defenses have been operating rather effectively from what we know. We've seen initial reporting from the UAE and Qatar that would seem to suggest interception rates north of 90%. Now, interception rates north of 90% still means that 10% of projectiles get through, and those could be prioritizing and targeting high-value assets like oil and energy infrastructure. There are simply too many assets, high-value assets, including civilian population centers, energy ports that are on Iran's target list. And obviously, it would be difficult for any defender to try and defend all of these extensively at the same time. Now, there are options for the Gulf states. They could allow the U.S. greater operational access to their airspaces and open up new attack vectors of Iran. They've tried to stay neutral, but I think the risk here is that Iran is pushing them into closer alignment with the United States. In a more extreme situation, we could see the Gulf states engage themselves in preemptive strikes against Iranian missile launchers, or potentially even join the fight against the U.S. I think the default and baseline preference for the Gulf states is to play the role of mediator, is to try and de-escalate the situation and find a diplomatic off-ramp for all the parties involved. Yeah. That's always been their preference, and they've been trying to do this and to try to avert this war where they find themselves on the front line for many months and weeks.
Hasan, thanks so much. Hasan Alhasan, they're a senior fellow at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and Tina Fordham stays with us, and we'll talk a lot more about markets and the way forward. Coming up, stocks tumble while the dollar and oil rise. We'll look at investor reaction to the war in the Middle East next. This is Bloomberg. Now, the Israeli military has launched an offensive against Hezbollah targets in Lebanon after the group fired rockets towards Israel in retaliation for the killing of Iran's supreme leader. Let's get more from Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem. Dan, thank you for joining us. What's the latest on the strikes between Israel and Hezbollah?
Well, it's a fast escalating conflict across the Middle East. No great surprise in this part of the Middle East, in Israel, with the opening or the reopening of the front with Lebanon. Hezbollah having sat out the first 36 hours of the US-led war on Iran, decided to fire into northern Israel about a half dozen missiles and drones overnight. It says this was retaliation for the killing of Iran's supreme leader. It's worth remembering that Hezbollah, the Lebanese group, receives both funding and ideological guidance from Iran, and Israel now says that this is a new front. It has bombed extensive targets in Lebanon, dozens of dead. Israel says these include senior Hezbollah figures. And in addition, the Israelis have ordered the evacuation of some 53 villages in southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley. These are villages identified with Hezbollah in what was Hezbollah's former fiefdom before the Gaza war, in which Hezbollah took part, really led to that militia in Lebanon being largely driven back. So a very active second front now, or at least second front for Israel. There are many fronts now in the Gulf with the inclusion of various Arab powers that have found themselves attacked by Iran. The big question being asked in Israel today is whether the Israelis will make do with airstrikes or will proceed and build on those airstrikes with ground maneuvers inside Lebanon. This is something that will very much worry Lebanese, the government in Beirut, which has tried to effect a peaceable dismantling and disarming of Hezbollah since November of 2024, a ceasefire there with only limited success.
Dan, thank you so much. Terrific briefing. Dan Williams there in Jerusalem. Now, global stocks have tumbled while the dollar and gold are up as investors seek havens. With us now, Karim Chedid, head of EMEA investment strategy at BlackRock. Still with us, Tina Fordham, founder of Fordham Global Foresight. So thank you both for sticking around and joining us. Karim, I mean, you see a very, important flow. Of course, oil is taking the brunt of the uncertainty, given what could happen to energy infrastructure in the Strait of Hormuz. Mm-hmm. Is everything else behaving as it should?
Yeah, of course, first and foremost, thoughts with colleagues and friends and clients in the region. But when we look at what's happening, as you said, 20% of global oil and other materials flow through the Strait of Hormuz, and of that, 30% crude. So some important statistics there to bear in mind. Importantly, markets and clients that we're speaking with are looking at this at the moment as a volatility shock, not a supply shock. And there's an important distinction between the two. Right now, energy infrastructure is not as impacted as other targets. And so in that context, we are seeing some risk off in markets, but it does seem contained. We are seeing a cautious tone, not a panic.
What needs to, if there is, and I've read a lot of notes this morning, impossible to say, again, we're saying with Tina, just go so fast, but could the price of oil go back to 60, 65 if there's a ceasefire and the Iranians rebuild? I don't know whether that also encompasses a change of leadership, or does it go to 108 or even higher with the closure of Hormuz?
Absolutely. What you're describing here is that there are fat tails. There's no doubt about that. But the base case is what we're seeing play out right now, which is this introduction of new risk premium on politics into the oil price, this $7 to $8 handle increase in the oil price overnight, not a spike to the 100 and above. And in this type of environment, what the question is really what happens to growth and to inflation. We have come into this with a pretty risk-on view on risk assets, with the idea that growth is strong. We were going to talk about AI today before all of this, and the impact of AI on growth is still happening in terms of a positive upside shock this year. Whereas there's also the impact on inflation. These limited oil price increases could see some pickup in break-even. You could see the front end under a bit of pressure. We look at inflation linkers, short duration inflation linkers in this type of environment. But largely speaking, it's not this seismic shock to inflation.
Yeah, and again, Tina, going back to, I guess the tailwinds, but actually because we just don't know exactly what is happening hour by hour because the strikes are ongoing. How do you think about, what happens next in Iran? Yeah. We don't seem to have a clear plan from the U.S. apart from a change of leadership. There's no, day 2, day 5, year 6.
So there's no end game, and there was no strategy laid out. I mean, I have to say, I feel like it's an advantage at this time to have been in the markets for the 2003 Iraq war, right? Because it's just not as clinical and as contained as investors who don't remember that trajectory. There is real reason to be concerned for a range of asymmetric impacts, especially given the fairly scattershot approach from Iran with its retaliation and the risk that Hamas and Hezbollah sleeper cells are triggered, are activated, possibly hitting U.S. and or European soft targets. That could really take this to a place where today's investors just aren't prepared for the kind of damage. This is much more than inflation, right? Lots of world leaders are caught up in this. Modi had a high-profile visit to Israel, big hug to Netanyahu. Lots of workers from India and South Asia also caught up there. This is not going to be easily contained, and I don't see a ceasefire coming anytime soon.
And so the reaction function for gold is, again, is it something that will go higher, no matter how long this lasts for?
So I would point to three things that we're seeing investors do and have expected to continue to see investors do in terms of bolstering portfolio resilience in an environment where there is some tune of an inflation shock that could challenge the role of diversification in the stock-bond correlation, right? The first is gold, as you said. Gold is continuing to be an effective hedge in times of geopolitical volatility, especially in terms of diversifying from sometimes positive correlation between stocks and bonds. Second is market neutral strategies that don't take excessive beta risk and focus more on long-short views and relative value views. And third, and this is where we're seeing a lot of demand into options, it's buffered equity strategies that help manage drawdown risk in equities while staying invested.
Are you also looking at, away from the markets? I don't know whether it's a question for now about, the future of some of these financial hubs because they attract tourism, or whether it's actually the blowback politically that the UK and France could get. There's a million things that we need to ask ourselves.
So this is the horizon scanning that we're doing right now. The fact that, Dubai civilian infrastructure was targeted, as well as Bahrain, will come as a shock to the region, which had thought that they could kind of have it all. It's cakeism, having your cake and eating it too at a different level. That means the sense of security and stability that has been cultivated is now under pressure. I would say that there's very low tolerance for in the UK and France for getting involved in another Middle East conflict. And then finally, remember, there's a short window before U.S. midterms. So President Trump didn't really calculate on oil prices rising.
Tina, thank you so much. Tina, Fordham, Karim, Chedid, and this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. Iran says it has shot down a U.S. fighter jet over Kuwait as the war in the Middle East escalates. President Trump says the bombardment of Iran will continue until there's a change of leadership. Oil jumps as much as 13% with the Strait of Hormuz all but closed. European natural gas futures surge over 25% as the conflict threatens global flows. And airspace across the Middle East is now shut, forcing the closure of some of the world's busiest airports and leaving thousands of travelers stranded. So oil has jumped as the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz stokes fears of global supply disruption. Now, European natural gas futures have also spiked on supply concerns. We're joined by Jeff Currie, Energy Pathways Chief Strategy Officer at Carlyle. Jeff, as always, thank you so much for coming on. So first of all, what's your base case of how long this lasts?
I think the probability of regime change is somewhere around 30%, which means the base case is this thing's going to be a protracted experience. In terms of thinking about what this means in terms of the risk is, let's go back to the Iranian asymmetric doctrine. It means proxies. In this focus on disruptions in the Hormuz Strait, I think, are misplaced. Yes, we're going to lose supplies there. I'm not going to say that's not going to happen. It could be 100 million barrels plus, which is the size of that oil supply gut at sea, which, we've been dismissing for the last 18 months. But I think the real risk is we're going to see proxies in other places. You have, I think, the Abraham Lincoln sitting in the Gulf, the Ford is in the Eastern Med, and the Houthis are in the Red Sea, but nobody's guarding places like Mozambique LNG or other choke points around the world. And I think Iraq is another one you got to watch really carefully, and that's the second biggest member of OPEC. So I think, the risk here this is a protracted environment, and that, the risks are to the upside. One last point here is we've been talking about a security premium in energy prices now for over a year. I think this is it. This is going to be a structural repricing, and I would not fade this current spike.
But Jeff, so just so I fully understand, this would be basically Iran and proxies going after energy infrastructure to almost on purposely put the price of oil up so that Trump backs down.
I'm not going to go. That could be part of it. I think there's a bigger point here, is that the risk of your supply chains right now have never been higher. And if you're China, you're India, you're going to start to hoard oil. And not only oil, but all commodities. I think I was on here 2 or 3 months ago, banging the drum on hoarding. The hoarding situation is going to become more extreme. So that increases the demand for oil. At the same time, you look at supply. Yes, OPEC announced a 200,000 barrel per day increase, but you look at past compliance, that's 80 to 90,000 barrels per day, less than half, because we're capacity constrained outside of Saudi Arabia and UAE.
But what do you think is needed for the Strait of Hormuz to normalize? And actually, you don't think that will really normalize
I
over
think
the medium term?
You look at why we think you could get disruption in this, I'm going to say this first kinetic storm, is because it's like a hurricane. You're shutting down the rigs, you're evacuating crews, the ships are being moored just like it were a hurricane. That's going to last for probably 7 to 10 days. Once we pass that, this current kinetic storm will probably subside. But the overall situation, we don't know where it's going to hit next. I guess it goes back to this whole idea of Iran's, asymmetric doctrine. It could be anywhere.
So how much do you think will be lost? I mean, is it impossible to quantify how much supply could be lost?
Okay, let's just go through the math. Let's say there's 20 million barrels per day that go through the straits. You have pipelines through Saudi Arabia and through the UAE that could take out another 6.5 million barrels per day. You have inventories and things of that nature. So let's put it at, let's say, 8 to 10 million barrels per day. Do that for 7 to 10 days, you get 100 million barrels per day plus. Let's say that's the same size as that floating glut that was sitting in like the South China Sea. So it's kind of a wash. But then what happens after that? That's the point here. Yeah, I would be careful fading it because it starts to become much more serious. One last point is, let's not forget, the reason why people were not reading that oil supply glut correctly is because we have 2 supply chains in the world, U.S. block and China block. You need more inventory for a bigger supply chain. And what ships are getting through the straits right now? Russian, Chinese, and Iranian. So the China block is still flowing oil through the straits.
Yeah, where's China going to buy more oil from? I mean,
right now they're buying it from the Russians. Yes.
But I thought actually that the U.S. I mean the U.S. was much more tough on India, right?
Yeah, on India, but not on China. So
Would
they just
gave
more for China to consume. Remember, the way they sanction it is through the SWIFT payment system. Yeah. China has its own payment system. It's called CIPS. Contract for International Payment, Cross-Border International Payment System, CIPS. That's the replacement to SWIFT. In these ships, they have their own transponders, their own payment system, their own insurance. We're in a different world than it's a bilateral world, and oil is at the center of it.
Jeff, so what does it mean longer term? Does the oil price automatically stay at these levels, about 80, 85? Or, again, the asymmetrical risk is that maybe it goes back to 70 or it could go to 110.
Yeah, I think that's what I've always said about people playing this from the short side. This market going into this was priced for a high level of complacency. Nothing can happen. That's what they've seen. Going back to 2019 when we saw that bombing of the Saudi facilities. Nothing can happen is the view. This is now the real deal. And the probability that this thing gets protracted in other regions, I think, is quite high. So, as again, the volatility is going to be high. The situation's fluid. I wouldn't fade it.
Okay, what happens to the hoarding impulse?
The hoarding impulse is just going to accelerate. Now, the question is, does the U.S. do the opposite of hoarding and open up the SPR?
I mean, would it?
But
to help
think about the insurance policies. You're slowly but surely getting rid of all the insurance policies. They already took it down 200 million barrel plus. There's about 400 left. You take it down another 100 to 200 to offset kind of disruption. Again, what's left over after that? Look at OPEC spare capacity. Only Saudi and UAE can grow production. There's no more real production capacity. Non-OPEC is likely to start to decline. You look at U.S. shale production. It's beginning to roll over. Low prices last year, eroding capital expenditures. The list goes on and on. But the market is so complacent.
I know, Jeff, I mean, at the same time, I don't know whether there's a timeline miscalculation because, President Trump is going through the midterms and he needs, his biggest concern is affordability. So he needs a price of oil that's playing ball. Right. If this continues, it's against what he wants.
Actually, let's look at all the commodity markets out there. I like to divide them into commodities that have an atomic number that are in the periodic table. Inorganic commodities. Then there's the organic commodities that have they're a molecule. They are carbon, hydrogen, CHs, carbohydrates, hydrocarbons. Carbon is the basis of life and the basis of affordability. So all the commodities that are molecules, grains, food and fuel, basically, they're suppressed. Why? Because of what you're talking about. They are affordability. All the other commodities that are in the periodic table, they've gone straight up because they're not a concern. And you've weaponized the periodic table. And now what you're going to see these other commodities join that group. And what was driving it was hoarding before. It's hoarding now. And then you have this huge underinvestment theme that's driving all of these different commodities. That's the revenge of the old economy we've been talking about for years now.
What does it mean for Europe? I mean, you have like bystanding countries.
Europe is in the worst situation of the entire world. Why? Europe is not part of the China bloc, so they can't access the Russian and all the other supply we've been talking about. And they're not long oil and energy like the United States. So they're in a worse situation. And European gas, as you said, is up 25% this morning. In fact, the convexity in natural gas, TTF, if you're looking for a hedge in this environment, European gas TTF is the one with the most upside.
But so does it have an impact actually on the war in the Middle East?
Well, actually, the war in the Middle East. Yeah, but the problem is you have two choke points for Europe. They have to get it through the Red Sea, and they have to go out of the Hormuz Straits. So that's why it's up so much. And I don't think it's so much Europe has an impact on what's going on in the region, but it's the other way around. Europe is the one the most vulnerable.
But in terms of military, I don't know whether it makes them second guess on how heavily they want to be involved.
Right. I think they're in a situation. They're in a really rough situation, and the inventories in Germany are in not a good place right now. So that's why I'd argue if you're looking for a hedge in this, what's going on, buy TTF.
Jeff, if you had a minute to brief either OPEC or the U.S. president right now, what would you tell them?
Be extraordinarily careful. This market is got no room for error. The narrative around this oil supply glut, I've been here for 18 months going, there's no evidence of it. Yes, you have some floating storage out in the South China Sea. Inventories are low. Spare capacity exhausted. Insurance policies are no longer available because we've exhausted them over this complacency. So I think you got to be incredibly careful. You're threading a needle, and so I would be very cautious to upside risk.
Jeff, thank you so much. As always, Jeff Currie, their Energy Pathways Chief Strategy Officer at Carlyle. Now, travel chaos is extending through the Middle East and beyond. Carriers across the Persian Gulf have extended blanket flight suspensions, causing major disruptions at some of the world's busiest airports. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Europe and Middle East Airspace reporter Leen Al-Rashdan. Leen, thank you for joining us. So what airlines and airports have been impacted?
Hi, Francine. We have the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain have all closed their airspace. Iran and Israel, obviously. These are massive disruptions at a scale unseen before. You have airports that are some of the busiest hubs in the world, the biggest international airlines halting operations. Some of the airports have been struck. They've all been evacuated, and airlines are extending the cancellations. It doesn't seem there's an end in sight, and there are thousands of people stranded, thousands of airlines thousands of flights that have been canceled, and this is rippling through the industry. You can see Lufthansa's down this morning, Cathay, Singapore. This is going to have ripple effects over globally.
So, Lynn, what will be the aftermath of the disruption?
I mean, even if airspace is open, the airports are still, they have damages. The airlines have to evacuate people who are still in the country. I mean, they have to repatriate. They have to bring back passengers who are stranded abroad. They have to bring back their carriers. I mean, most of the Emirates Airbus A380s are not even in Dubai. So we're talking about disruptions that are going to last for at least a few weeks, and the financial impact is going to be very large. If you look back at when the floods happened with Emirates, they lost about $100 million, and that was on a much smaller scale. So there's going to be hundred millions of dollars in impact.
Lynn, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Europe and Middle East airspace reporter Lynn Al-Rashdan in Dubai. Now, coming up, what next for Iran and what's Donald Trump's endgame? We'll discuss that next, and this is Bloomberg.
The president had an obligation not to go to a war of choice, but to come to Congress under the Constitution, but much more importantly, to go to the American people to make the case before we spend resources and spend our blood and treasure.
There is no constitutional ban on the president continuing this fight. There's a statute called the War Powers Act that has never been constitutionally tested. So it may well be that the president could continue for a protracted period of time.
If we're talking about 20 million barrels a day of crude and refined products that have already been bottlenecked in the Arabian Gulf, and the prospect of having this go on for a month, I mean, that's 600 million barrels that could potentially be deprived to buyers around the world. That's basically a week of no oil.
And while the death of Ayatollah Khamenei is historic, the real objective and the metric of success for the U.S. here is to complete the destruction of Iran's military capacity. Now, every time we see the Iranians out shooting missiles, operating drones, that actually expands the target list.
Well, some of the voices we've had on Bloomberg Television reacting to Donald Trump's decision to go to war in Iran. Now, 3 days into the war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, what can we expect to see ahead for the escalating conflict? Well, joining us now is Jasmine El-Gamal, founder of Averos Strategies and a former Pentagon advisor. Also joining us from Abu Dhabi is Aniseh Bassiri, Tabrizi, senior analyst at Control Risk. So thank you both for joining us. Aniseh, let me start off with you to try and understand what you think is happening within Iran. So President Trump says first they won't stop until there's a change in leadership. He's also asking for an uprising, which I think is a very tough ask for a population that has already gone through so much. What do you see happening in the next week? How organized is the new leadership?
Well, thanks for having me. Well, I think the expectation from the Iranian establishment was that the assassination of Khamenei was likely, and the preparations for the transition were probably already made before. We have to remember there was a war back in June already, in which there were rumors of a potential targeted assassination of Khamenei. So I think at the moment it seems that the transition is pretty smooth and according to the Constitution, with the leadership council in place and allegedly the appointment of the next Supreme Leader in the coming weeks. Now, does that mean that the regime has not been affected? Obviously not, because there have been a number of targeted assassinations of commanders, of senior military people. But we are seeing that Iran is keeping on retaliating, on responding. There is no sign of changing the direction. Ali Larijani, who is a very senior figure, who was the advisor of the Supreme Leader, has said that Iran does not intend to negotiate and will continue its retaliation. So at the moment, it doesn't seem that Iran is halting its attacks. It doesn't seem that it has been weakened to the point of any prospect for regime collapse or even less for a transition to a new regime, so whatever President Trump is looking for. And instead, it seems that the leadership is moving to sustain the damage internally and externally as much as possible.
Jasmine, how do you see this? I mean, again, from within Iran first, it's difficult also to understand what the end game of the U.S. administration is really. I mean, they talk now about a change in leadership, unclear how they would support that or who they see as a natural leader.
Absolutely. I mean, I was just going to say there's a real discrepancy here between Iran's objectives and its game plan and the U.S.'s objectives and its game plan. The Iranian regime has been planning for this scenario probably for years. This is not the first time that they've been under perceived threat and now, of course, actual threat from the U.S., from Israel. You know, this has happened before. So they have plans for when the Supreme Leader is assassinated. They have plans for when the head of the IRGC or defense minister are assassinated, right? And their objective right now is very, very narrow and very clear. It's regime survival. And everything that they will do and are doing is focused towards that narrow goal. Contrast that to Donald Trump. No objective, no roadmap on how to get there, no legal foundation for this because there was no imminent threat to the U.S. And now you have constraints. You have Congress breathing down his neck. The Senate comes back today to debate Senator Kane's war powers resolution. And there's a real question in Washington right now about whether Congress can meet this moment and stand up to a president who thinks he has absolute power without a plan.
Aniseh, I mean, if Congress does, I guess, clamp down on what the president tries to do, does it put the population of Iran in an even more difficult situation? And how do you see, the leadership in Iran looking to energy infrastructure? Part of the Strait of Hormuz is now closed. Would they go, full scale and really try to close it down?
Well, two very important questions. So obviously the population in Iran is stuck between a rock and a hard place. I think, there were a lot of people hoping for this operation to actually take place and for the assassination of the Supreme Leader to take place. But again, that to transition into a new leadership and, some positive change for the population, I think it's optimistic to say the least. I think we are expecting weeks and weeks of instability, whether led by the war or by the internal dynamics as well. We saw the repression that was exerted right after the January uprisings, but also after the war back in June against those who were considered as potentially betraying the establishment and as an excuse to suppress any potential for dissent to emerge. So this is very likely to come once the external threat, if the external threat comes to a halt. When it comes to the calculation from the Iranian side on what to target, I think we have seen, obviously, that from the Iranian point of view, this war is existential. It's about their survival and their continuity. So I think the more the expansion of the targets inside Iran, the more the sense that they are vulnerable and potentially subject to an existential threat that could lead to the collapse of the regime change, the more likely the targets will expand into including also energy infrastructure. We have seen already some signs of that. And I think we are likely to see more, depending on what targets are going to be targeted from the U.S. and Israel, and what is going to be really the end goal now that the head of the establishment is gone.
Yeah. Jasmine, do you think when it comes to air defense from Israel and the Gulf states, have they been surprised by the swiftness of the attack and the intensity of the attacks from Iran?
I think the Gulf is much more surprised than Israel. Israel, of course, was expecting these attacks from Iran. We saw during the 12-day war last year what happened, and we anticipated that it would be the same, but potentially escalated because the threat is bigger now because it's regime change. The Gulf has been completely just knocked off its feet. First of all, they were the ones who were begging Trump and really counseling him for months to try to avoid this war, and they feel really betrayed that after doing that and after trying to fend off this war, that Iran would target them. Of course, the Iranians are saying we're just targeting U.S. bases, but that's not true anymore. They're also now starting to target oil infrastructure. They're targeting hotels. I'm speaking to friends all over the region. They're terrified. Everything is at a standstill. So in terms of, and you know, I will say that Gulf air defenses have really performed well, but it comes at a cost. These are expensive equipment to operate, and each time they intercept a missile, it's costing them money. So how long can they keep this up for? So what I'm watching for right now, just to follow up on what your other guest was saying, it's not just about the physical closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but it's these attacks on regional oil and gas infrastructure facilities. Qatar and the UAE produce a fifth of LNG and export it to Asia and Europe through the Strait of Hormuz. But the critical infrastructure in the region right now is what we're looking at. Yeah. And the internal conversation between the Gulf state as to how to react, because there is now a conversation happening where you have some members of the GCC more inclined to be more aggressive and proactive in their response against Iran in joining a security architecture with Israel and the U.S. And you have other countries like Qatar, for example, like Oman, who are saying, hold on, can we really afford this? Let's take a step back and figure out what to do next.
Jasmine, what do we know about Iranians' capabilities, right? Weapons capabilities. Again, we don't really know how much they have stockpiled or if the intensity can go on for much longer.
That's right. I mean, it's a notoriously opaque regime. Now, we know their nuclear program was severely degraded, but they were able to, according to intelligence reports, reconstitute most of their ballistic missile program after the 12-day war. So we're looking at continued missile strikes. And now with the entry of Hezbollah into the war, with these rockets from southern Lebanon being fired, we're looking at activation of proxies as well over the next few days.
Okay, thank you both for joining us. Of course, this is a story that we'll continue watching very closely. Jasmine El-Gamal, founder of Averos Strategies, and Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi, senior analyst at Control Risks. Now, Bloomberg is also at the JP Morgan Global Leveraged Finance Conference in Florida. That's where we'll be speaking with the CEO, Jamie Dimon, at 7:15 p.m. London time. I know he'll answer questions not only on geopolitics, which he often enjoys weighing in on, but of course everything that's happening in terms of risk on the credit and private market as well. The markets, speaking of which, look, there's a lot of stress out there. Jeff Currie was saying there's not maybe as much stress that he was expecting, given the scale that we're seeing overall. But oil is spiking higher. I'm looking at a couple of other things. Look, stocks definitely slumping. The dollar is up. The conflict in the Middle East is adding fresh headwinds for markets already on edge over U.S. tariff policy, but also disruption from AI and stress tied to private credit. Up next, Bloomberg Brief, and this is Bloomberg.